Welcome to this special episode of Shelter and Solidarity. We are now closing in on 2 years of regular conversations, paralleling as we have the course of the pandemic that pushed so much of our lives online. Tonight, we focus on organizing in higher education with longtime labor movement leaders. While many consider higher education to be a special place, its rarefied atmosphere protected from the broader trends in society, our conversation will reveal that it is anything but an ivory tower. Indeed, higher education must be seen for what it is, yet another site of social contestation. If US higher education was a country, its GDP alone would equal Sweden's. Like any large economy, it has been susceptible to and a driver of the dominant system of our times, capitalism in its neoliberal form. As such, the contests that we will discuss, bemoan, and celebrate belong at the center of broader struggles, those against capitalism and for human survival. My name is Suren Mudliar, and I'm one of the show's producers, as well as managing editor of the journal Socialism and Democracy. To frame our conversation this evening and to welcome the authors of Power Despite Precarity, as well as our respondent, I'd like to introduce our co-host, Linda Liu, a member of UMass Boston's faculty and a producer of the show. Linda, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Shelter and Solidarity. And I'm going to introduce Jo Berry and Helena Worthen's new book, Power Despite Precarity, Strategies for the Contingent Faculty Movement in Higher Education. This book is an indispensable resource for the growing numbers of precariously employed faculty who are interested and involved in the struggle for job security, decent wages and benefits, better working conditions, and basic dignity and respect. It is part history of the struggles of the California State University lecturers to win what is considered to be the best contract for contingents in the United States, and part handbook full of lessons and strategies for effective contingent faculty organizing and collective bargaining, building our own power, and connecting our campus struggles to the broader political, economic, public health, and environmental crises we are facing today. And as contingent faculty myself, as well as a union official and organizer, I owe Jo Berry and Helena Worthen a deep debt of gratitude for writing this book and for all the groundbreaking and difficult work they and other contingent faculty organizers have done to make the jobs and lives of contingents less precarious and more hopeful. All right, so Jo Berry is a founder of the Chicago Coalition of Academic Labor and leader of the International Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor, or COCAL, and New Faculty Majority. He is the author of Reclaiming the Ivory Tower, as well as the co-author of the book we're discussing today, Power Despite Precarity, Strategies for the Contingent Faculty Movement in Higher Education. Jo, welcome to tonight's Shelter and Solidarity. Jo Berry.
Thank you for having us.
Okay. Helena Worthen is a novelist, union activist, and retired contingent faculty worker. Her book, What Did You Learn at Work Today?, won the 2014 Best Book Award from the United Association for Labor Education. She is also the co-author of Power Despite Precarity. Helena, welcome to Shelter and Solidarity.
Thank you, Linda.
Joe Ramsey is a senior lecturer in English and American Studies and a contingent faculty activist at UMass Boston. His work on academic labor issues has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, and Cognoscenti, and he is active in the new national coalition, HALU, or Higher Ed Labor United. Welcome to the respondent role today, a rare one for you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's nice to be able to relax a little bit and focus on content rather than form as you and Seren generously step into the hosting tonight. I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion.
All right, great. So I am just going to launch into the first question. And this question is for Joe Barry and Helena. What has the reception of your book been like so far, and who have you heard from? Have there been individual contingent faculty or contingent faculty organizers or organizations who've reached out to you? And what were some of their responses?
Well, we have been very happy with the reception of our book. We've had some wonderful reviews that are often very long and sort of summarize the entire book. And they've appeared in Jacobin and other places like that. And they are extremely respectful, and unfortunately, as Joe will explain a little bit further, they have not been very critical. They've mostly been explanations of what's in the book and giving a whole lot of attention to telling the whole content. And we've also had some bulk orders. The California Faculty Association has bought 250 copies and handed it out to activists for use in study groups. And I've been asked by the Connecticut community colleges also about getting a bulk order. And we know that Washington AFT has bought a bunch that they're going to use as prizes at a conference. So the book is getting well reviewed, and it's getting bought and used in contingent faculty organizing situations. And I would say that what we haven't really seen is criticism of it or the other side. I think Joe Ramsey is going to talk later on. He is probably, of all the people who have really read the book and worked on it, he's the person who's taken up the issues in it and sort of repackaged them and balled them up in a different way and rolled them back out so that they go up to another level. So all of this is wonderful, and we're selling a lot of books, which was the idea, since we wrote it basically as a handoff. We wrote it as a way of putting together everything that we knew as of a year ago when we sent in our final draft, so that we could hand it off to the next generation and say, okay, here it is, do whatever you can with it. So that is really happening. However, Joe has a flip side of something to mention about that.
Yeah, the only thing that really keeps us from being everything that we hoped for was that we have not gotten reviews in more mainstream publications. And partly because, we were hoping for that, although that's difficult, because we want to reframe how adjuncts, how contingent faculty are seen. And the majority of stuff that's been written about us has been the victim narrative. Either individual memoir kinds of things, or did you know that this horrible thing is going on, the dirty little secret of higher education, that sort of thing. And we would like to impact luckily the movement has moved past that. That is not what takes up most of the space in movement meetings anymore. It used to, but it doesn't anymore. But in the broader public realm and even the broader public realm of the labor movement, we want to reframe the victim narrative, and the way to do that is to have the book be reviewed and popularized in the kinds of places that broader labor activists read, and that people interested in higher education generally and activists on the progressive side read, and to see us and our movement in a different way, and to see the movement at all, and not just us as a collection of victims. So, you know, that's what we would hope for in the future. If anybody listening to this has a line in to, you know, to the Nation or any comparable periodicals, can get us a mention or a review. We're real interested in that, and we would facilitate people getting review copies.
And,
Go ahead, Elena.
never mind. Let's move on.
Okay. Joe, your first book took a long time before it got a mention in the New York Review of Books, but it came eventually, didn't it?
Yeah, interestingly, yeah. Let's see, it was published in 2005, and that came in just before COVID. So that was more than 15 years later, more or less.
Yeah.
And where it was called a landmark in a collective review of other stuff about higher ed and contingent faculty, and everything else was recent. So that was nice, and Monthly Review kept that in print, and we expect that Pluto will keep this in print now under print on demand kind of situations. That's much easier to do, of course.
So Joe, you and
We hope it's got some legs.
you and Helen are therefore in this enviable position now where you can complain about good book sales and many reviews, and yet advance to the next challenge, which is breaking into the mainstream conversation. And the other enviable position you're in now relative to the past is that you believe, and I think I agree with you, that we've moved beyond the victim narrative, or we're moving beyond it, certainly. And that would only have been possible because of the literally decades of struggles which you chronicle in the book. So I'd like to ask you about those decades of struggle in light of broader societal changes. So stepping back into history a little bit, as well as into the broader context for this conversation and for the books. The theoretical and political practice of the California Faculty Association forms a major part of this book. In the 30-year arc of organizing in the Cal State system, California went from being defined by the austerity of Proposition 13 to something of a one-party state with social democratic aspirations. How does this California transformation interact with contingent worker organizing, and particularly that of the CFA? And I ask this mainly to draw out the interactions, not only how the broader transformations have affected the campus struggles, but as importantly, how have the campus struggles driven this transformation or been part of this transformation?
This is a good one for Joe.
Okay. Well, first, I want to say that I think the perception in the rest of the country that California is fundamentally different is an erroneous perception, and is put forward by the media, and which is a coastal media for the most part, and it's not helpful to the movement, and it's not accurate. It's true that in the recent past, California has been pretty much governed by the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party might as well be two parties here. It's like AOC said, only in the United States would she be in the same party with Joe Biden. And that's absolutely true. In California, you have, a Democratic Socialist wing of the party, and veering into social democracy. And then you have the dominant corporate Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, which we win some tactical victories and pressure them, but they basically hold the whip hand, and so it's not as different from Republican-dominated places as might be thought of. I would say that our struggle is more, we think, and that's one of the thinking behind the book, we think that this stuff is more applicable to other places than not. The big difference is whether people have a union or not, whether people have some kind of organization or not. And in California, the vast majority of contingent faculty do have an organization. And now with the recent, last few years efforts by SEIU in the private sector, that's true in the private sector too, which is not as substantial in higher education in California as it is in most places in the country. So the vast majority, so compared to 20% nationally are represented by a union, contingent faculty. In California, it's well over 50%. That's the difference. But the terrain that we fight on is not that different. And we fight in the terrain of collective bargaining, we fight in the legislature, we fight in all the various terrains that people fight in, including the streets. So I hope that sort of answered your question, but I reframed it some in the typical way that difficult interviewers often do. Interviewees often
Interviewees.
do.
Okay, well, putting back the interviewer hat, and before I turn this over to Linda, and Linda's question addresses hopes and fears, I want to ask you about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and of the other third parties. What's the relationship between the union movement that has consolidated some gains in California and those more social democratic or even democratic socialist parts of the political parties?
Well, it's they're not fully united and integrated, just like everywhere else in the United States, because we don't have a workers' party. But it's a terrain of struggle, and now we have an organization that's got 20,000 members, Democratic Socialists of America, and some other organizations collaborating with it, and some social movements that have some oomph. The Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the lesbian, gay, transgender movement, that have some real oomph and are making pressure in this context. So that's that's what I would say in a short form to that. But yeah.
Thanks, Joe. Linda, do you want to put the next question to Helena and Joe? Oops,
Sure. So Joe and Helena, you encourage us to use the metaphor of a scale of hope and fear, where organizing can be seen as the work of, quote, moving grains of sand from fear and fatalism to the hope and courage side of the scale. Many contingent faculty, of course, have a hard time overcoming their fear and fatalism enough to get involved in collective action and advocate for themselves. So I'm wondering, how did you personally tip the scale enough from fear and fatalism to first get involved in contingent faculty organizing?
Okay, well, we're looking back a certain distance here. I did not grow up as an organized radical at all. I was a poet and a musician and things like that, and wound up teaching English all over the place in the Bay Area. Everything from technical writing to novel writing to drama to medieval drama to remedial reading. And of course was getting worn to the bone by it and getting angrier and angrier as I saw things sort of getting worse around me. And I actually believe in the psychoanalytic or psychological truism that depression is that depression is repressed anger, and that if you can get in touch with the anger and do something motivated by that anger, then the depression dries up and goes away. And but that's not something that you want to do by yourself, because if you walk out the door motivated by the kind of anger that many adjuncts actually feel, you're likely to find yourself misbehaving in large meetings, not treating your boss with adequate respect. I found myself sort of blessed with a version of Tourette's that would cause me to swear in large administrative meetings when I was there to discuss some kind of curriculum issue. Anyway, what happened was that I was cut off from one of my favorite classes by my department chair, who said that a full-time faculty person wanted my schedule, and therefore my class was gone, and therefore my paycheck for the next 3 months was basically gone. And I was furious and expressed myself to her, and she very quietly said, why don't you go to the union? And I had quite unknowingly signed up for the union when I got hired. And thank heavens I did, because when I went to the union office, I was still furious and said things like, you people never do anything for people like me, etc. And the union president didn't throw me out. Instead, he asked if I would like to come to a meeting. And after I calmed down, I did go to a meeting, and I heard people discussing the very issues that were important to me about the governance of the college. And it was like night and day. The union meeting was so much better than the department meeting that I could hardly believe it. And they encouraged me to get involved with organizing the other contingent faculty, the part-time faculty. And lo and behold, it sort of took off and never stopped. At that time, I was very lucky because there was the beginning of a statewide movement. Joe Barry was part of it, and you can imagine what happened next. We were able to persuade the California Federation of Teachers to actually pay for for conferences and for a newsletter and for some meeting time and travel, and that pretty much did it for my fear and fatalism and depression. That was really over. I was still mad, and as you can probably tell from the way I'm talking right now, I am still mad 30 years later, I guess. But it's so much better to be angry and having a good time with people that you like and respect, even people that you've never met before. It's so much better to be having a good time with them than it is to be miserable by yourself. That's the story of how I got involved.
Great, thank you, Helena. How about you, Joe Barry?
Well, I mean, I came from a different place. I was a movement activist. I was in high school, and I got involved in the civil rights movement as a depressed 16-year-old, and it did solve my depression. The movement saved my life, and I always say that, and I'm not kidding. And I got involved in the civil rights movement, and then the anti-war movement, and then the student movement when I went to college. And and so when we're both third generation teachers, and so when I got out of school and was gonna teach, and was lucky enough to get a credential in spite of my peripatetic student history and arrest record and being thrown out of school. I of course looked for the union immediately because by that time, I was a socialist. I was an organized socialist. I was a member of a group, and And so I came to this differently. But I would never have stayed a teacher if I hadn't been a member of a union that defended me when the boss tried to fire me. Even though the leadership of the union hated me because I was part of an opposition caucus in the union, and but an honest staff rep and a really good shop steward, building rep, defended me against the administration, who had screwed up their own procedures so badly that we won the grievance and I got a permanent position, probationary, and then eventually tenured in the public schools, to be later laid off after Prop 13 and the coming of the neoliberal era. But nevertheless, I ended up being able to stick in education, and then moved into higher education and getting adjunct jobs starting in about 1980, and immediately looked for the union there. And there had been some adjunct activism in California in the 70s that I could connect with, and one of them was at City College San Francisco, where I got my first job, and we restarted the part-timer committee in that union, and you know, that's what I've been doing. That's sort of been my, ever since I left the church, this is my religion.
Thank you, Joe and Helena. You know, listening to you.
Oh, I want to say one other thing, excuse me. The other big thing that happened in this process was that I met Helena. And we met at a union meeting, literally. We're introduced by the state president of the Community College Council of the California Federation of Teachers as people who should be talking to each other. And we both were involved with other people at that time. But so he was trying to build the organization and build the movement. And so we were comrades for 2 years before we were ever a couple. But it was we both owe the California Federation of Teachers quite a lot for that.
That's a really heartwarming account. Thank you for sharing it. I should add that on hearing both your and Helena's account of the road to the union, Joe's short road and Helena's somewhat circuitous road to the union, I understand why the book is dedicated to your parents and to the fact that their lives would have been better, as you say, had they had the opportunity to join a union to advocate on their behalf. Also, from Helena, I take away that organizing plus anger equals a cure for Tourette syndrome. And so, good. Okay. You know, I'd like to also, hearing your story reminds me of the fact that the left really and unions really need to be welcoming places for people, because the moment we cease to be welcoming places, people go to other movements and other spaces, and then we end up with things like we saw in Ottawa and other places, and so I'm really glad that you related this point. Joe Ramsey, our respondent and regular host of this show, is someone who's benefited from your organizing. That when he joined UMass Boston, he was joining an institution where where adjuncts and faculty were part of the same union, and with a very strong contract that really protects their rights. So I'd like to turn to Joe and get his reaction to this book. Joe, you've read the book. You've also responded to the book by writing a piece of your own. Can you describe your reactions and how you see its ideas relating to your own experiences as a faculty member and as an organizer? Joe?
Yeah, thank you, Seren. Thank you, Helena and Joe and Linda. Anyone who's read the draft article that I've written in response to this book, and there actually are a few of you on this call, Bruce Simon and others who have read this, as well as Linda and Seren, will know that I'm going to have to keep. I can only say a few bits of what I think. I've written, like a 12,000 word article, which has not yet appeared, but which distills 25 major truths from this book, and that's actually cut down from 30. So, I mean, I have a lot to say about the book. I have very strong positive feelings about it. I mean, I think this is a book that's written from and out of, as the authors have already indicated, reflections on a lifetime of practice, and praxis, right? I mean, I think it's a book that is very much grounded in experience and the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of organizing and contracts and labor law, but it's also not afraid of theory, right? I mean, that's actually a point they make in the book, that we need to have space for theorizing strategy, so that we can actually extrapolate from experiences and talk across campuses and states. And so I think it's wonderful for so many reasons. I mean, I basically read it twice. Once kind of zooming in, I think after kind of looking through it, kind of zooming in on the more theoretical, more obviously kind of universal elements. There are chapters, which we might discuss later, that are very much foreground, kind of key contradictions facing our movement, troublesome questions I think we might get into later. So, I really started there and almost kind of read the book backwards the first time, with the more, you might say, theoretical aspects, the more kind of universal elements, and then going back into the kind of California-based kind of month-to-month, year-to-year narrative, which, and then I read it again. As I was writing it's not really a review, but this article. And I mean, I guess I'll just highlight like two things right now. I mean, one is, I think Helena already touched on it. This is a book that really acknowledges and helps us to theorize the anger and discontent and depression and emotional struggles that adjunct and contingent faculty often go through, but which doesn't just settle for like amplifying that feeling or dramatizing that victim status or the inequity, but really talks about the need and the possibility of channeling that anger, of channeling that emotion in ways that can actually be effective and that can help to build power. So, I mean, I think that it both acknowledges and helps us to build concepts. I mean, as Helen, I think, just did a wonderful job a moment ago, talking about how, what it's like to have a job that doesn't give you the virtuous cycle of a job, right? A job, to be working for decades, years, decades, and having trained for years or decades to do a job where people still don't recognize you, where they don't claim you, where you don't have a stable office, right? And what that can do to a person, and the need for our unions and movements to kind of factor that in, that damage the stress, but not just to succumb to that as if to dramatize that as a victory in itself, And so I think it's full of just very practical things, but also theoretical perspectives. The other thing I'll say is that just a very practical thing I appreciate about the book, drawing from the California contract precedents, but also other research and experience, they really make it clear that though we do need an inside-outside strategy, a kind of united front strategy with other tenured track faculty, contingent faculty do not need to, nor have other unions settled for kind of accepting the inequities within our own unions. I mean, they do a great job talking about the need to struggle against what might seem like neutral, normal terms like across the board raises, which actually increase pay inequity within our already inequitous, unions. The possibility and the reality to fight for conversion language, for first, to give first priority to non-tenure track or contingent faculty adjuncts for new jobs that appear in their field. That in fact, an outside hire should have to prove they're better, or that there are contracts that require that departments prove there's a more qualified, not equally qualified candidate for those jobs. So I appreciated this book both on like a theoretical, both psychological and kind of big picture political perspective, and on its kind of nitty gritty, precedent setting, horizon raising, concrete horizon raising. I mean, I'm literally going to be making some of these arguments, and already am, in my own union, which I consider to be a very good progressive union, but we still have a ways to go. And I think that, your book is concretely, I hope will be affecting the next round of bargaining that we have on our campus, which I hope the organizing for that bargaining starts, in about a month, once we've recovered from the most recent one. So again, thank you both for this book. There's much more to say, but I'll stop there.
All right, great. So the next question is actually for all three of you. Just to return to the hope and courage side of the organizing scale, what are some of the signs of hope that you see in our current moment? And do you see these signs of hope as enabling more contingent faculty to have the courage to step up and get more involved?
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the news about organizing right now. There's the I would say there's the opposing narrative, and I'm not quite sure how to break these things out. Joe and I were having a discussion earlier. There's the narrative that there's the great quit, the great resignation. There's the labor shortage. That feels like a cold fog of a narrative that is being sort of blown over the whole countryside as a way of chilling things out. And the reason for that would be that there is something to chill out, which is a lot of organizing going on. The Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't even keep track of strikes that are less than 1,000. So there's no way to actually count how many strikes are going on right now. But did you see there was a little thing that happened in Mississippi with the school bus drivers? Who saw that? There's a little group of school bus drivers in a town in Mississippi, and because of COVID, a bunch of them didn't want to get stuck in a bus with a bunch of sniffly kids. And so they weren't coming to work, and the school district decided to hire some additional drivers and pay them $5 more than the ones who were already hired were getting. And so this little group of bus drivers simply went on strike for about 4 hours, and they got their raise. They got what they wanted. That kind of stuff is happening all over. It's happening in Starbucks. The Alabama miners at the Met mines are still on strike. There's another run at the Amazon organizing. So there's a lot of stuff going on. There's some good news about credible strike threats at UC Berkeley and the AFT there, and at Harvard, that really got a lot of attention. The more prestigious the place, the more likely it is to make the New York Times. And then the Columbia strike was the longest ongoing strike? I'm not sure about that. But there's a lot of turmoil going on at the grassroots level. A lot of rumbling going on at the grassroots level. And one of my things that amazes me the most is the formation of this new organization, Higher Education Labor United. And Joe Ramsey knows a lot about that, and so does Joe Barry. So I would like one of them to speak up and describe what that's like.
Joe Ramsey, do you want to take that?
Sure. I was just looking for the link, which maybe someone else can put the Higher Education Labor United links in the chat box for our great audience, a live audience here. Yeah, I mean, the question is signs of hope and change. I mean, I think that's one that really resonates for me. Higher Education United, HELU. We have actually a winter summit that is going this week, starts tomorrow, which makes this kind of what we're doing right now a kind of unofficial kickoff event. I hope we can circulate this conversation among the group that will be meeting for at least 4 days over 5 days, 4 days of conferencing. I understand about 500 people have registered for this conference. HELU is an organization that has its vision statement, a really great vision statement we could also share in the chat box, endorsed by 114 campus local unions and organizations. This is an organization that has started at the local level. It's also working with state unions, like such as my own Massachusetts Teachers Association, but it's building across national unions, all the major higher ed national unions, from UAW to the Steelworkers to NEA to AFT, working across locals, across states, regions. I think we have 30 states that have local representation. I mean, we still have a ways to go, but it's a real attempt, a real effort to try to create a basis for creating a national, a conscious and present to itself higher education labor movement. And I should point out, not just a faculty movement, a movement that includes and welcomes and in fact centers staff, the medical workers, as well as professional and classified staff, as well as graduate student employees, contingent faculty, tenure track faculty, and mixed unit. So it's going to be a great summit this week, folks. It's free to register. I hope that many people who haven't heard about it will check it out. But we have great, I mean, you can tell I'm excited about it. It's going to be, it's both going to be, have some terrific headliners speaking about, I think it's 5 p.m. Eastern Standard every night of the coming week, 5 to 7 or so. And then a lot of concurrent sessions and more democratic discussion sessions where we'll really be trying to craft united and potentially uniting and mobilizing campaign plans, both for local campus coordination so that collective bargaining can become inter-union and more an inter-campus, so that we can unite around common demands, building towards regional and campus-wide and system-wide actions that raise the consciousness and make it impossible for the mainstream media to ignore, to connect with, but also to build a legislative agenda, right? To put pressure on the federal and state dollars that flow into universities and put things like labor requirements on that money. So again, it's not legislative action as a substitute for direct action. It's really about trying to link those things up. And I'm just so impressed by the core organizers. I'd say I'm in that second layer, not at the core of this effort. And I'm very, very impressed by this group. And I just encourage anyone who hasn't checked out the HELU folks to check out Higher Ed Labor United, because it is definitely, I think, a reason for optimism. But obviously, it will only be what it could be if as many of us get involved as possible. So yeah, I mean, Linda, that's one thing I'm certainly hopeful about right now.
Thank you, Joe. What I'm especially grateful for is the detailed description that you provided of HELU. It allows me to ask Joe Barry this follow-up question about HELU, which is from Joe Ramsey's description, we're seeing something that we've seen before, but never quite at this level of complexity and breadth. Is this true? Is my sense of things correct? Is Joe's description reminds me of the optimism of the early days of COCL, and yet it seems to be on an altogether qualitatively higher plane. Is that correct, Joe Barry?
Well, this is certainly not the first attempt to form a coalition across union lines, across divisional lines within higher education, across regions and disciplines. But it is, you're right, it is the most hopeful, the strongest, the deepest, the broadest, and I might add, the most led of the joint coalitions, the most led by people who represent the majority of people doing the work. Contingent faculty, graduate workers, and staff. It's not dominated by full-time tenure track faculty leaders, however good or progressive they might individually be. And all the previous joint coalitions have been basically dominated by them. The Coalition on the Academic Workforce that did some good research and included disciplinary organizations, the Campaign for the Future of Higher Education, which, by the way, was inspired out of the CFA, out of a couple of former presidents of the CFA, not accidentally, and including people who were part of the revolution in that organization in the 90s that we talk about in the book. But and consequently, it's much more respectful of those of us who have basically been second tier and being shit on most of our career, and who are so shocked to being treated with respect that we're suspicious of it in many cases. And the people have to build trust and that sort of thing. But it's the most hopeful that's taken place up till now. And I think, the other thing I want to add to the discussion of what is hopeful out there is that, I mean, the existence that COCAL has continued to exist. We're going to have a conference, which is now North American wide in Mexico in August. And I'll put that up. Somebody could put that cocalinternational.org website up there. But that's going to be in August in Mexico, covering, you know, the United States, Canada, and Quebec, and those have been going on since the 90s. Every other year. This one's been delayed 2 years because of COVID. But also that the pressure that has developed has caused, you know, we have a president who actually made a statement in support, direct support of workers on strike while they were on strike. Made a statement directly in support of workers trying to organize that they should vote for the union. Even no president, Democratic or Republican, has done that, you know, since Roosevelt. And I'm not sure that even Roosevelt ever did that in the middle of a strike. He certainly didn't do it a couple of times when the union movement wanted him to. There's some famous quotes from John L. Lewis to that effect. And so I'm not saying that this makes a fundamental difference in terms of the Democratic Party or Joe Biden personally, but it reflects the power of the movement to cause a president to feel that it is politically advantageous for him to do that. And it reflects a shift in the terrain that we need to, you know, acknowledge, strategize off of, and take some credit for. And that has given people courage to move forward. We've had, you know, just in the San Francisco Bay Area, at a strike at the California College of Arts, and that is going on. Strike threats at the University of California system statewide that got them the best contract they've ever had, and rivals now the best contract in the country, I think, for contingent faculty. And that's a contingent only unit, lecturers only. It's the biggest contingent only bargaining unit in the United States. That was going on at the same time that the near strike at Harvard and the strike at Columbia among graduate assistants, the recognition of the graduate research assistants with a serious strike threat in the University of California system, and bringing the boss to the table, who had been refusing that for months and months. So, you know, there is a lot to be hopeful about. And some of it has even broken into the mainstream press. Both the San Francisco Chronicle and the Los Angeles Times ran major lead editorials, not op-eds, editorials from a pro-worker perspective about these contingent faculty and graduate struggles, which are unheard of, frankly, for neither one of those publications are known as being particularly pro-labor. And the Los Angeles Times actually they delegated an editorial writer to spend an hour and a half interviewing us. That had never happened before. I mean, we almost fell over in shock, but we managed to gather ourselves together enough to conduct the interview with her.
Thank you, Joe, Helena, and Joe Ramsey. I should say that it's been a long time, at least in my life, that I've been able to have a question posed about hope and get a long answer and a substantial answer. And so I'm really grateful to the three of you for it. So now we started out with hope. Joe told us about the energy and the growing organization. So we have hope, energy, and organization. That takes us to the question of strategy. And so I'm going to pose one last question to the three of you before we turn to to our audience, so that there can be less of an audience and more participants. Just before we do that, I should also say one more housekeeping thing. Linda's internet connection's kind of intermittent, and so that's why there's some latency between us going to her and her asking a question. So I just wanted you all to be aware of that. So let me ask you this question then. It's been mentioned before in this conversation, and when we're talking about HELU, to a certain extent, we're talking about an outside strategy, but we are working with people in unions. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the inside-outside strategy is, And perhaps we could start with Helena and then go to Joe Berry and then briefly to Joe before going to the audience.
Actually, the inside-outside strategy is a little bit complicated. It isn't exactly what you get when you look up Gramsci. And therefore, I'm going to ask Joe to handle this.
Okay. Joe Berry?
Well, in a one sentence summary, the inside-outside strategy is what subservient, subaltern, second tier, oppressed, second class folks have come together to use in all kinds of organizations and situations throughout history to gain power through relationships with larger groups that have greater power that they don't control. And it's been used by minorities and majorities. But the notion is that the group that is unequal, that is placed in the second tier, that is being discriminated against or whatever, or has to organize itself outside of existing organizations and institutions to speak in its own voice and to speak with a somewhat unified voice and act in a somewhat unified voice in order to have influence inside the larger organizations that they don't control, but which are necessary in order to move the struggle against the real causes of their oppression, which are not, the organization, the disciplinary organizations or the unions or those kind, but the real seats of power, the employers and capital. And this is not something that we invented, although I've talked about it so much that there are people who think I invented the idea, but they're wrong. And certainly, even though the term is, relatively recent, the idea goes all the way back to the anti-slavery movement and in the 19th century, and probably earlier. But I'm a recent American historian, so that's what I know. So the notion is to organize the group that is without power in and of itself, to speak for itself, and then to act together within to leverage the power of the larger organization that can impact the greater, the greater system. In this case, our system of employment and in higher education. And it's like I said, it's a strategy that people have gotten to without theorizing it, unconsciously in many cases, through caucuses, committees, whatever format people came up with. But we're trying to theorize it, popularize it, cause people to critically analyze how they've applied it and how other people have applied it, so as to be able to apply it better in the future in a more conscious way, which is what theory is supposed to help us do.
I think it's important to say that it's not necessarily an opposition or a dissident strategy. It's a strategy to get the power of the more powerful organization to work for the less powerful people. So nor is it really a taking over strategy. It's a way to equalize the power appropriately so that the weaker parties can benefit from the power of the more powerful parties.
Yeah. It's a contribution to solidarity and ultimately to union strength. It's the same as if unions refuse to acknowledge racism, refuse to organize Black people, refuse to put people of color appropriately into leadership positions. That weakens the whole union. That weakens the whole struggle and makes it less able to win stuff for anybody. And that's the point. And that's why solidarity is necessary and need to overcome these historic divisions and prejudices. And now I'm gonna make a little criticism of you, Seren. You referred to faculty and adjuncts. We are faculty. In fact, we are the majority of faculty. And every time somebody makes that mistake, it's like scraping fingernails on the blackboard to us. And so don't do it again.
Could I jump in before you do, Seren? I mean, similarly, for anyone who's going to speak later in the conversation, I feel similarly about the distinction calling contingent faculty part-timers. I like to say more often than part-timers, we are double timers, actually, often working even more courses than the tenure track folks. But I really want to pick up on the last point I think Joe made very well, or right before the point about terminology, which is that, I mean, I think the inside-outside strategy, I feel like is very powerful. I mean, I'm going to say one very positive thing and then one challenge maybe that we have the inside-outside strategy faces, but it's just like one of our tasks in kind of enjoining us to continue to struggle within structures that may not be ideal, maybe tenure track, tenure blind, tenure track dominated, or otherwise not structured to serve contingent needs consciously or not, but there needs to be some education, right? The inside-outside strategy is also the opportunity to educate and challenge tenure track, tenure line colleagues within our union and professional structures, but not simply from the standpoint of feel our pain or, sympathize with us, but also from the standpoint of the tenure track faculty, and whether unionized or not, cannot be powerful without us. I mean, like, they say certainly not in a labor sense. You can't talk about a tenure strike without the contingent faculty or any kind of plausible threat to disruption. I mean, there is a shared interest under there. Contingency eats away at tenure line security as well, right? I mean, every pre-tenure faculty has to dangle over that, that pit, right? And to the extent there's no safety net down there, their ability to speak freely and pursue the work they want is also constrained. So I feel like there is a basis. I believe that this inside-outside strategy is based on a kind of objective truth, which is that there is shared interest there, right? Especially when we think about the interest, including, saving the planet or, defending academic freedom to defend democracy against fascism. There is the basis, for shared interest and struggle. And so we shouldn't be leaping to just cut our tenure track faculty off. That might feel good, to posture in that way or whatever, but it's just not viable. It's not viable in terms of numbers. And it's also, I think it's not based on the objective analysis that there is a basis for unity, which doesn't mean, and here's the second point I want to make very briefly, that there isn't going to be struggle, right? Because I think the challenge of an inside-outside strategy, and I know Linda and I know this personally, is that, struggling in a union where there can be this kind of tenure track baggage, it can be difficult to sustain non-tenure track enthusiasm and optimism and hope and a sense of our own power if there are kind of petty, things undercutting you within your own union, right? So, I mean, I do think it can be a struggle to one of the big, you call it, in your book, you call it the revolution in your union, which I'd love to actually hear more about at some point, if not tonight, to some other time. But, there is a need to change the way our unions are, whether it means literally contingent faculty leading them or just forcing our issues so that they're not seen as a kind of special interest. So they're put at the center, contingency, not just contingent faculty issues. This idea that, everyone who does their job well should have a right to that job if it's socially necessary. And I'm hopeful that, I think the inside-outside strategy gives us the possibility, but also the challenge of actually educating as well as learning from our tenure track colleagues so that they can realize that basically their power can only become what it could be if they actually recognize us as full faculty too. And so I'm excited about that.
Thank you, Joe. I should say right away that I fully accept Joe Berry's comment about my comment. And so I definitely apologize for that. And in a time where we recognize microaggressions, it's important to recognize that these things actually correspond to real problems of power in our society. I would also add that as someone who has been an adjunct faculty, especially when I was in that position quite a few years ago, it would also have been like fingernails on a chalkboard. With that powerful imagery. My ears actually ringing from the sound of fingernails on the chalkboard. I do want to, before going to the audience, I want to go back to Linda and allow us to address troublesome questions. Linda?
Okay, so there's a part in Power Despite Precarity where you discuss what you call some troublesome questions that surfaced during your years of collective organizing and union experiences. Questions which you believe are common to all union organizing efforts. And these are questions of concrete practice and strategy that have no easy answers, as you say, and that are often left to the discretion of local organizers. Can you give an overview of these questions and what your proposed solutions are, and why the inability to deal with them openly can undermine solidarity?
Can you post them? We sent you a slide that if you could share it, because there's 7 of them, and it's hard. We wouldn't want to take them sort of one by one.
Right.
I'm going to do that right now.
Okay.
Great.
Now I'll begin by explaining what they are. These are questions that Joe and I and others, because we've talked to a lot of other people, have found coming up in every organizing situation. And these are not just about faculty. I have seen them in garment workers. I was a member of the National Writers Union for many years during the time when we got together and threw out the president. And I've been in a bunch of different teachers' unions. And in every case where there's been a group of people who are trying to organize in order to get their act together and get some access to the power that the overarching organization possesses, these questions come up. And they do not have right answers. If anyone tries to give a correct answer to one of these questions, they have short-circuited the discussion. If a group of people can get their act together around these questions or around any one of them, it will build solidarity. And if they fail to do this, there will be a crack in their solidarity because they will have a weak spot in which they can't speak confidently about what we want or what we feel. They can't step forward out of their small group and represent the feelings and goals of that particular group. So here are the questions. Would anybody like to pick up on one of them? I'm not going to suggest that Joe or I pick one of them because in our book, we probably go too far in trying to give sample answers to them, especially in the one about, is this legal? Which has really 2 parts, meaning can they do this to us, or can we do this without violating labor law or getting arrested? So is there one of these that one of the people who is listening here would like to identify and draw attention to and talk about?
And I noticed that in the chat, the question was asked, number 1, how do people get started and what keeps them moving? So maybe by way of transition to the audience, we could address that one question.
I see Marcia Neufeld with her hand up. That's likely to be a good question. And and Nina Kammerer, somebody I don't know, who suggested we talk about union politics. So how do you want to do this, Søren?
Well, let's go to Marcia then. Hi, Marcia. Well, can one of the other co-hosts unmute Marcia? Marcia?
I saw her hand up, but
Okay.
maybe she was just waving.
Yeah, I'm not seeing Marcia now. She was here. She was right at the top of my screen, but I'm not seeing her now. So maybe
Well,
she'll come back.
how about going to Nina Kammerer then?
That's a good one. Okay.
By the way, I cannot see the chat, so.
We need to
Hi,
maybe.
hi, I'm Nina Kammerer, and I am a faculty member in Massachusetts. One of the things that for us in our union is not just a teachers union, and I think that when unions are focused on teachers, you have a leg up. But when you have multi-sectoral unions, there are a lot of issues about just how precarious, or whatever you want in contingent faculty are, their conditions are so different. And so I'm just really interested in what advice you have about that. Because, I love my union, and I really would like to have, to be able to strengthen the collaboration across the sectors, to help all the sectors, but to help our sector.
Joe, do you want to note some of the clarifying questions that we ask when people say, I don't want to get involved in the union because I don't want to deal with politics?
Well, what people really often mean is not that they don't want to deal with the Democratic Republican kind of politics, but that they don't want to deal with the conflict that takes place when people try and organize. And the unfortunate fact that a great deal of union politics becomes personalized, like other politics in the United States, becomes personalized and the source of, long-term feelings of being disrespected and dissed in general, and people have long memories, and it's and also the fear of drawing attention to yourself in any way, and I think that we consciously try to avoid discussion in this chapter about the personalism of union politics, and because that exists, but what are you going to say about it? We want to emphasize the principles, and what are the principles that we need to focus on as contingent faculty to transform our unions in a positive direction, and what's the sort of the standards we need to apply to union politics as issues arise. And our argument is that the standards that luckily we are not only a subaltern group, we're also the majority. So we can fight for democracy, without any question. For minorities to fight for rights and democracy is a little more complicated because they're not the majority, right? It's not so obvious to people, right? That they are being inappropriately oppressed because they're not the majority. But we're the majority. We don't have that problem, and now in the last few years, we even teach the majority of the classes in higher education. And so that's one of the key criteria for union politics. What encourages majoritarian behavior, higher level of activity, right? And transparency, because if you're the majority and things are transparent, you got access. There's a famous theory of learning that Helena talked about a lot in her other book, called a
Community of practice.
Community of practice, that was actually coined by Jean Lave and her co-author, whose name escapes me right now, but I don't want to remember it anyway. who is a now retired professor at Berkeley, the idea that in order for knowledge and practices to pass down from generation to generation and to spread, there has to be certain characteristics in a community of practice. It has to be transparent, it has to be accessible, it has to be, the rules have to be known by everybody. People have to be it's not sandbox politics, just performative, but it's real, it's real. Real power is being exchanged, real work is being done, whatever. And we can apply that very much to our unions. And that's what we need. That's our general take on the idea of union politics. And then there's a million variations. There's a very good, and I want to encourage people to access this, very good ongoing weekly discussion run by the brilliant Barbara Mandoloni from Labor Notes for higher education activists every Friday. And, somewhere between 10 and 30 people get on it for an hour every week, talking about just these issues from the point of view of people trying to organize, from the point of view of people working in opposition caucuses, trying to change their unions, and from the point of view of people who are in some degree of union leadership, trying to figure out how to do the right thing and manage all the relationships that go along with that. I would very much encourage people. You can just go on the Labor Notes website and find out about it. But it's every Friday and is a wonderful, continuing high-level discussion of just this question particularly.
Yeah. So this is, just to be clear, this is a public higher ed workers, right? The few organization out of Labor Notes. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I forget what PHEW stands for. Public higher education workers, is that it?
I think so.
But it's not really just public either. I mean, they conceive of higher education as a public function, which is appropriate. Even if the institution is technically private, nonprofit, or even for-profit.
I mean, just on this question of this troublesome question, I'll just, as a respondent, to say one thing. I mean, one of the most important things we did in our union, and I won't name names or anything like that to get it, but was to kind of change the dynamic so that and to take leadership at the executive committee and at the presidency so that those sorts of issues were no longer the dominant kinds of issues. I mean, I think for years and years, people in our union had, kind of come away oftentimes with experiences that were all about, individuals and personalities and changing the personality or changing the leadership has enabled us to actually get to the point where we are able to now consistently have issues, arguments around and discussions around real issues. And people can disagree and you can have arguments about that, but it doesn't devolve in the way that it once did. And it doesn't, at least I like to think, it doesn't turn people off, even if, they don't get their way on a particular thing, although there's a lot of consensus. It's principled, right? It's based in reality. It's not just, and it's not a waste of time, even if you don't, not everything goes your way.
Well, that was what that was what I encountered in my first union meeting, which made it possible for me to walk in that door and spend the rest of my life there.
Okay, so let's take a brief round of questions. First from Marcia Newfield and then from Bruce Simon. Marcia?
Hi, thank you. Sorry I got cut off by myself. I just think the biggest problem, thank you for Joe and Helena for continuing and continuing and continuing. Your persistence is only matched by your optimism, which I
And
must.
yours.
I don't know
And the
about that.
persistence is matched by yours.
But the thing is, the problem that I'm encountering, I'm no longer teaching, but I'm working on, for a long time, I've also worked on grievances and the contract and the relationship of I work on adjunct grievances. And the biggest problem is fear.
Yes.
Fear of losing your job. Like today, I had a conversation with a very distinguished author, very distinguished, but controversial. And he is not being given the title at one of his institutions, one of his CUNY institutions, of associate adjunct versus assistant, which the other college is giving him. And we were ready to try and argue this because a dean who knows him from grad school and hates him and is competitive and all that stuff, really doesn't want to help him, says I can't give a promotion, right? So we're ready to grieve it and, article, blah, blah, but he is refusing because he is afraid that if he initiates a grievance process, he will not be appointed.
Right.
Even though right now he doesn't need the money, because he's very well known, but he likes that school. He likes the students there. Okay. And so he doesn't want to give it up. And that's the fear always. And during COVID, when many of our colleges are under enrolled, adjunct courses are being eliminated they are being replaced. They've assigned a course and then 2 days before they're told it's not running because a full-timer needs their schedule. So to me, it's very depressing. It's very depressing. And that adjuncting, the contingent part of adjuncting, which is the gig economy that is not just in higher ed, is a demoralizing, dependency evoking attitude. I mean, on the part, and even though we at CUNY, 25 schools, have an executive board, have a delegate assembly, and more adjuncts are active. When I start, there was like 2 and now there's like 20, but it doesn't matter. We don't have the real power. The real power is still held by full-timers who still buy into the meritocracy argument, which is the reason they have a full-time job is because they're better. And if you can figure that one out, break through, they do not see us they see us as a collective in one way, but not in a deeply operative way.
Well, do you remember the Stewart update? This went out to we were told it reached 16,000 people once a month. It was a monthly publication. Anybody here remember that? It got sold to Cornell, and it died within a year because it stopped being really it stopped having a deep labor consciousness. But Joe and I used to write for the Stewart Update, and we would do kind of a grievance article. We'd take a problem, and often the editor, what was his name, Joe? Come on.
Sorry.
Well, you'll remember in a minute. He would pose a problem. I don't know, it might be a health and safety problem. It might be exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, Marcia. And he would say, okay, write about this, show how you would collectivize it. Show how you would teach, how you would get the steward to collectivize it, which would often mean, taking the person's name off it, turning into an educational thing of some sort, finding histories of similar things. Joe would get on the internet and find all the history of similar things. It had to be in both US and Canada because it went to Canadians as well. And the idea was to take a problem that really bites at the heart of somebody who is feeling disrespected in a very, very personal, physical way, like the label on his little brass door plate, and turn that into something that other people can get involved in. And that does mean expanding it, just expanding it way beyond what originally showed up on the doorstep of the grievance officer.
Just adding on to this, I just want to say, Marcia, I thought you made a really, really important set of points there. And this, I think meritocracy and the way in which tenure line faculty often subscribe to it or tend in that direction, but also the way in which, and Joe and Helena talk about this in their book, the need to shed the tenured gaze, the way in which a certain kind of meritocratic notion can actually be internalized by contingent faculty as well, despite we are the consciousness we have that we're teaching twice as many courses for half the money or less. So I think this is a huge challenge. I don't have an answer to it, but I do want to pose it sharply. What can be done? What has been done in terms of problematizing or raising up meritocracy as a problem? I mean, there's all kinds of great books. Thomas Frank has a great book about meritocracy, you know, is this kind of like limitation of the liberal, you know, formerly liberal Democratic Party left, but how do we really explode it? I mean, just off the top of my head, I would say, you know, one thing is to really drive home the injustice of the inequities and really to own them. I mean, I think I was just doing the math recently. Even a full-time contingent unionized person at UMass Boston, and we can make fairly good salaries compared to a lot of folks on the contingent side. But the difference between a tenure track person and a contingent faculty in the same department at the same level over the course of a 30-odd year career, 35 year, is $1 million. Right? It's $1 million difference, right? Even though, I mean, I think that's one, I mean, I think, but I also feel like I frankly feel on a day-to-day basis that I need to take baby steps with my tenured line faculty. The educators must be educated. And so I think we need to just fight for progressive raises, to just like establish the principle that there is an equity in the union. It's not meritocratic, just, you know, and get them to say we should be fighting for a 5% raise for the people making 40 grand or 30 or less. And even if that means a lesser percent for the people making higher. Obviously, we don't want to focus on that as the primary contradiction. The primary contradiction is, you know, with administration, and beyond that with society and the state. But, you know, I think we need to find, I guess I would say, baby step ways to get the fundamental inequity, you know, kind of admitted and discussed in tenure line ranks. Like some little thing that they can, that you know, that can become mainstream. I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I would love to hear people's ideas about how we can actually break through, whether through persuasion or force, this kind of meritocratic ideology. And I'll shut up.
It's built
Ms. Jo?
into the American system, and you know it. Success and individualistic success and money. It's the name of the game. I mean, it's like you have to change the whole social structure. It's like bucking the Catholic Church. I mean, it's not that people are invested, they work for it. The whole idea, I worked for my thesis, for my PhD, you know, I worked for my publications, I worked in the I mean, and it's not that they didn't, they did. It's a big deal. It's I don't know.
Yes, Joe, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I remembered the guy's name who did the Stewart update for years and years was the son of an old UE organizer, by the way, a left-wing union leader. David Proston was his name.
Yes.
And I wanted to say that, you know, speaking to the point of that Marcia made, I think, you know, she's completely right, of course, but we can't let either the fear or the fear of what full-time tenure track faculty may think of us or do. We can't let either of those things determine our strategy. We've got to focus on lowering the fear level one by one, group by group, among our fellow workers. That means talking to people you don't know, talking to people, you know, all the things that are the hardest for any worker to do, and especially for college teachers who've had all these years of education that says it's a meritocracy, you rise on your own initiative, the truth will make you free all by itself, all of which are complete lies. You know, the truth won't make you free at all unless you organize around it. It is not a meritocracy, and hard work is not rewarded. Nobody works harder than poor people in this country. And I just wanted to add a moment of levity. You know, one of the jokes that many people in this room have heard, but some people may not have, and maybe it'll bring a smile to your face if you've heard it before. There's a joke among contingent faculty that, you know, anybody who says that they teach and function on the campus and off the campus in the same way that they would if they had tenure that person is either lying or too stupid to be trusted with a class. And, it's not a joke you often tell a mixed company, but, I figured it was appropriate here to these points, right? And we're the majority.
But we're not the majority of leadership.
No. And
And,
that's
and I have to jump in with this to say, and we're in a majority, but often doesn't experience ourselves as a majority. I think this is very important because of the way we're kept in motion, denied space, stability, scrambling. I think increasingly we are creating spaces where we can feel it, but we often, I don't know that most adjuncts feel like the majority, even though they might now know it intellectually. So I think that's one of the gaps we need to work on. How do we, it's one thing to know something, it's another thing to believe it. And that's like not just a subjective process, but a kind of intersubjective or a,
It's
social
another
process.
thing to get in on the power discussions. If you're
Yeah.
not in the leadership.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am now going to make room for some other people who would like to ask questions. So first of all, Bruce Simon has a question, and then after that, I'd like to take questions from Jeff Baker, Nicole Braun, and Tim Judge. Okay, so Bruce, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. I'm thinking about the way the community college and the organizing strategy that HELU used around Build Back Better did not come to fruition at the national level. And I'm wondering what the panelists think of a state-by-state approach that would focus on state budget season, where there's a Democratic governor and Democratic legislative majorities, and really trying to move the needle in those states to create good jobs, full-time, tenure eligible, extending due process protections, whether it's called tenure or not. What do you think of a national approach to look at states like, say, my own, New York, and really push a centrist governor to follow through on her rhetoric, which is great about SUNY and to some extent about CUNY, to actually fund a significant number of new full-time good jobs among the faculty as a start?
Well, as Gandhi said of Western civilization, it's a good idea. Let's try it. The Washington State AFT has been able to get 200 full-time jobs in their legislature. And now they didn't get any kind of upgrading from contingent jobs to the full-time jobs, so people still have to apply for those jobs. But the union is holding a conference this weekend, right in the middle of HELU, unfortunately. And one of the things they're doing is doing a job interview preparation session, and they have a lot of people signed up for that, of course, because these interviews can be psychologically crushing. The state legislatures are one terrain where a lot can be won.
Like the state legislature in New York that changed the pension system from tier 4 to tier 6, where you have to have 10 years of credited services, which is 2 for 1, to get a pension, to be vested.
But maybe to balance that out, we could look at also the Massachusetts. We have right now coming up this fall in Massachusetts something called the Fair Share Amendment, right? Which our MTA is allied with many other labor and community groups pushing for a millionaire's tax, right? Income over $1 million in a household a year, and would earmark for public transit and public transportation and public education, including higher ed, but not only. So I feel like these state level models, even when the federal strategy doesn't seem to be panning out, as if the Republicans take the House, God forbid, whatever, that may not be in the cards for a couple of years, right? But I do think we need to share and coordinate and concentrate forces at the state level too, and maybe we can still score some victories.
Thanks, Joe. I should note that we are at 8:30. So what we're going to do now is continue to take questions, but focus more on the people asking questions and making points. And the two Joes and Helena will confine themselves to really brief responses. So I'd like to go then to Nicole. Oh, I think Nicole is next. Nicole?
I'm here. Thank you. So I'm really enjoying this conversation. I can't even begin to tell you how much, since it's just so wonderful to listen to all this. And I also really appreciate all the ideas that are being raised. One of the things that I have been thinking about a lot is the sort of psychological to the sociological, in terms of like feeling despair and hopelessness to then the organizing space. And some of you may have read the article recently about the adjunct who committed suicide. So he was in the California system, a community college adjunct, and now his mother is, I'm just finding out about this, but his mother is putting together something for adjuncts, because she understands that there's like an emotional and economic issues with adjuncts and despair and that kind of thing. So I guess I'm sort of wondering about how to bring in, and then maybe this isn't the right place, but how to bring in with Helu, how to bring in maybe like more of a support crisis line group where it can be like a headquartered, but then link people back into their respective unions, or the possibility of organizing in that particular space, but also to have like sort of the understanding, like a therapeutic understanding about what's happening from like a consciousness raising perspective. So the person could call and say, I'm feeling despair. And, you know, then the person who they're calling can sort of like link them into the larger space so that it's not so isolating. It's not just them. Does that make sense? So that's what I've been sort of thinking about. I hope I'm making sense.
Makes perfect sense, Nicole. I'd like to go quickly to Jeff then, and we'll take one more question after Jeff before going back to our panel. And after that, we'll do another round of questions, going to starting with Tim. So
yeah, it's just a couple of quick observations and two things. One is in New Jersey, adjuncts, in the adjunct contract, there is now a provision for non-tenure track lines, for non-tenure track professionals. And so these positions have a bit more longevity rather than semester to semester. They will offer benefits. So it's a step up. It's not necessarily the step I'd like to see, but it certainly is a push in that general direction. The other thing I wanted to comment on, which we've had a problem, certainly at the institution I'm at in New Jersey, is an issue of shared governance. And where we have majority faculty being adjunct or contingent faculty, outnumbering the full-time faculty, we have no voice in governance from the academic side. There's a bit of a, you know, as the VP of adjuncts for the local at the institution I'm at, I get to go to faculty meetings and kind of represent the adjuncts, but the adjuncts at our institution do not have a vote in faculty assembly. And I think this is a crucial piece for getting over the fear components, getting over the issues of adjunct faculty not feeling that they have a voice. And I think it starts to level the playing field with full-time faculty when we all have that vote. The other thing, trying to get some parity, was that our last contract in New Jersey for the state colleges, we now have adjuncts have a per credit hour rate that is equivalent to the overload that full-time faculty get. And so we purposely tried to link those two together so that adjuncts were on the same level as full-time faculty for their overload courses. And that, I think, has certainly helped, but those are just some quick observations, and it's good to see everyone. Sorry I was a bit late to the start. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And we'll go quickly to Jeff Baker. Are you there, Jeff?
Yes, I'm here. I
Great.
posted this in the chat about the three major national organizations representing adjunct faculty. Take a look at it. I wrote an article about it that was supposed to be published in AAUP's Academe, and they pulled it at the last minute because they thought it was too critical. So if you want to read it, my email address is there. It's very short. So the question for Joe and Helen is, how do we get those organizations moving to do something? And I've tried. I went to a national AAUP meeting. I brought it up. They cited the fact, oh, we formed 2 new adjunct chapters last year. But AFT actually did all of the work, and they haven't followed up since.
If we can go quickly back to our panel, we have 3 questions. One about the space within the unions for consciousness raising and support. A question about representation in the university itself, in the academic senate, for example. And then the last question from Jeff, which is basically, how do we light a fire under the unions? Joe Berry, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, on the consciousness thing, I think that that's a constant battle. But the thing that changes consciousness is organizing and winning. The struggle is what changes people's consciousness, you have to have discussion to bring people into struggle, but that's primarily to build relationships. The thing that changes people's minds is seeing the world change in front of them. I remember Lenin said after the Russian Revolution, that people learned more in 7 days than they had learned in 7 years. And that is absolutely true. And anybody that's been on strike knows that. Any kind of intense struggle. So, the consciousness thing is what it is. That's how it works. It's the dialectic of how people learn and change. The governance thing, I would encourage people to read the AAUP's statement on contingent faculty and governance, which some of us spent way too much time crafting and getting through the various levels of AAUP, but it is up there, and it is the sort of the gold letter document, and it says that we should have full rights, and that the unions and the organizations and AAUP should fight to protect us if we're discriminated against or retaliated against for something we do in the context of governance. Except for, they carve out an exception that we shouldn't be judging promotion and tenure, which, I wasn't going to make a fight about that. That didn't seem to be the fight that was worth making. In terms of the unions, that's what the outside strategy is about. We're not in the business primarily of taking over the unions. We're in the interest of transforming them. And that will mean appropriate representation by us. But that's what the whole notion of the inside-outside strategy is that. And, there's a lot written about that. And I would also encourage people to read stuff on that topic. Well, basic stuff by Gramsci, which he didn't use those expressions, but that's what he's writing about. But also Rich Mosier has written a bunch of stuff over the years that talks about this in quite informed detail, as well as our chapter, of course, and the stuff that I wrote along the same lines in Reclaiming the Ivory Tower 15 years ago.
And Joe, do you want to take a bite at this apple?
I do, but I'd like Helena to go first if she's.
It's a pretty big apple. Which part of it are we talking about? What? Go ahead with somebody else.
Could I just say, I'll try to say like 5 sentences, okay? Like, I feel like on the consciousness thing, I think that I agree with what Joe Berry said about relationships being so crucial. I actually think that we need to think about ways to help contingent faculty connect with our students around these issues as well. I think that we spend a lot of time with our students, and a lot of us are, as you put it in your book, in the closet still with respect to our students. I'm not saying that I blame contingent faculty for not doing that, but I think that our unions, our networks, ourselves as well, to the extent that these things are ideological, need to really find ways to enable people to step forward and to kind of come out of the closet with students and then actually problematize these issues and talk about the connection between contingency for faculty and the undermining of student education. So I think that's the other thing I think is that like we need to make clear, I mean, a lot of adjuncts are motivated, like you point out in your book, about like trying to serve others, not we're fighting, even afraid to fight for ourselves. Well, you know, you point out in your book, if we want to have a chance of stopping the climate crisis, or if higher ed's going to play a role in the climate fight, we need to have a sustainable place for reproducing knowledge and critical inquiry. We need people who have the security to do that. So I think, you know, you give us at least a few arguments. I mean, I feel like things that can give courage is like feeling like people have your back, but also having like a vision that's worth fighting for. It's not just about you. And I mean, obviously ideology only goes so far, but I think those two things are important. And I think our unions and organizations and our just casual networks could do more to kind of help people anchor in either one of those, either just people having your back, creating models and resources to make it easier to let students in and have students as allies, anything, you know, I mean, and also just fighting to get that inch in a contract that then can make the mile possible. You know, give them an inch and they'll take an L, you know, even a little bit. I mean, one reason I can talk like this as a contingent faculty member is because people before me fought to get continuing contracts, right? Which is almost like, you know, tenure without faculty governance, right? At UMass Boston. So even if it's not pay equity, even if it's not ideal, getting people a right to a job to some degree can enable then the consciousness, you know, to be expressed and for people to be a little less afraid. So anyway, I mean, that's on consciousness and you know, but obviously it's a tough nut to crack. Like Joe says, it's an ongoing thing and it's not going away.
Thanks, Joe. I know that Linda is going to call on the next round of audience members.
Okay, so I'm going to take a round of questions from Ben Stork and Jason Premis. So Ben?
Hi, thanks y'all. Really enjoy the conversation. Hopefully I'll ask the question that I think maybe picks up on what was just being discussed, which is in terms of organizing, how much is it important to, and how do we bring up the actual status of the university and its function itself? I think this kind of speaks to the relationship between what we may be doing in terms of higher ed labor to the broader social conditions. You know, in part, it's that that we can connect that to say, I'm just going to use the meritocracy problem. Our job is to basically enforce the myth of meritocracy. So it seems like it's hard to make the argument to others whose job is similarly that meritocracy doesn't matter, that it's a myth. So how do we sort of do that? Like, do we need to engage in our organizing with the broader questions around higher education? That is, what is its role in society? How do we understand it as reproducing, right? And I don't think that's probably only going to amp up the fear, but is the question I often find as somebody who's maybe more left than my colleagues, who does sort of move more towards a radical position, that I often alienate my colleagues. And yet I also think that there's a sort of problem in some of the more bread and butter union approach, because it runs aground on a contradiction within our workplace. And so I was just kind of wondering about sort of how we approach that in organizing. And I should say, I'm at a private university, and when the pandemic hit, there was an opening for organization again, but the university was able to shut it down by just saying, well, you don't want the university to go away, do you? Right? So don't say anything, do what we say, or nobody has a job. And that had a real chilling effect. And I think that kind of pointed me to think about, well, what is the status of the institution? Maybe as somebody at a private institution, I can say I don't think it should exist. But I still, still wage dependent. So sorry, that's a lot. That's kind of what I was thinking about.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And let's take another question from Jason Premis.
Well, I think maybe Seren Mudliar should set me up for this one.
Hey, well, I guess in the vein of Ben's question about the status and nature of higher education, and almost implying, maybe I'm going too far, a Samson strategy of pulling down the pillars. I'd like to go to Jason for this particular question. As someone who's been involved in leading unions, struggling to transform higher education, working within the broader contingent faculty movement, as well as contingent worker movement, and having to pay a fairly high price and answer Marsha's question about what happens if we lose our jobs in higher education.
You end up running a Metropolitan News Weekly. Yeah, that's what happens. But yeah, okay. Very quickly then, why? Well, maybe should we just abandon this whole, American university model of the last 100 or so years, and try something else? I mean, Gary Zabel, who I think a number of you worked with in the past, and I, after I lost my job at Lesley University, after leading a successful core faculty drive in 2015 and being fucked over not only by the administration, but by SEIU. I'd love to tell that story in a presentation sometime. Gary was almost ready to retire. He's the guy that some of us call the great grandfather of the contingent faculty movement in the US since the 90s. And he was about to retire at UMass Boston, and was able to retire precisely because his generation of adjunct faculty in the 90s did win the kind of benefits that Joe and others, to one degree or another, enjoy. Maybe enjoy is too small a word, but we were wondering, about looking to trade schools, looking to folk schools, looking to earlier university traditions, particularly like the tradition of Italian universities in the Renaissance, Bologna and elsewhere, where the students essentially hired the masters, and there was a union of students and a union of masters, and the two unions effectively ran the establishments together. Do you all have any thoughts on just saying, everything's going to hell anyway, maybe we should try to do something else and figure out ways to fund it publicly and otherwise, while we still have a public? I mean, that's the broad question. You don't have to go back as far as like Nalanda University or Plato's Academy to answer this question, but there are other models out there. Do you think it's worth exploring them or not?
Well, I'll say something.
Okay.
I think there is something to be said for it. We can go all the way back. We were on the campus of what may be the oldest university in the world in Vietnam. And even there, things were far from perfect. They had emblazoned in sculpture summaries of the dissertations of some of the leading graduates back. We're talking 2,000 years, right? And but there was disputes over what should be in the summary and who should be memorialized. I mean, you can't, these are human institutions. And I think that, there are aspects of the history in the United States that can be positively drawn on. Aspects of the history of the land grant, many negative aspects too, right? Like the Indian Wars that got them the land in the first place, and handing a lot of it over to the railroads and all that sort of thing. But we, we're supposed to be, if we're leftists, and especially if we're Marxists, we're supposed to be dialecticians. We're supposed to sort the shit out. And if it's, and I don't see it as, number one, I don't see it as possible to completely reconfigure the universities short of a complete social revolution. And it's worth speculating about, under a social revolutionary situation, how we would reconfigure the universities. But that's a worthwhile discussion. But in the short and medium term, I think, thinking about how we can how we can, what struggles we should raise to reconfigure the universities and their functions. And I agree, there's nothing scriptural about the particular functions that higher education perform in the United States in 2022 or in 2090 or or back in the golden age of 1965, supposedly. The community colleges were party to destroying the apprenticeship system in this country to a great extent, for one thing.
Yeah.
And the growth of credentialization just run amok and degree, So I think that the discussion is worth having. But I don't want to start it with the point of view that because we've been screwed in this institution, by definition, therefore, we should tear it down and build up the blocks. I don't think that's not a realistic alternative that we face right now. And number two, I think we have to measure our personal subjectivities. I mean, we've all got terrible victimization stories we could tell. Anybody who doesn't, isn't paying attention. But we've got to get beyond our individual, personal, subjective stuff in trying to strategize. Helena, excuse me.
I think we can look back at the last 20 years, especially the years since the internet has become so powerful, and see ways in which the ruling class has tried to take the universities apart, whether it's with MOOCs or online learning or, starting centers overseas, like in China and in India, and then, raising tuition and bringing foreign students over here for the purpose not of sharing cultures and doing research, but for the sheer purpose of getting tuition money. You can go down and especially under COVID, see that the ruling class has been trying to do exactly what you're saying, Jason. They've been trying to take it apart so that there's nothing left but the relationship between teachers and students, which is where the wealth is actually created. I mean, that's the nut, that's the seed that has to go forward into the next generation. And I want to remind, I bet a lot of people on this call are familiar with Vygotsky. And do you remember about after the Russian Revolution, when there were institutions that had been knocked down, basically taken apart and had to get recreated? And Vygotsky and his friends, really young people, they basically handed the mandate of trying to, in their case, reinvent a Marxist psychology. So that's the story of the beginning of a whole new educational approach. And people who have been teaching English and composition and psychology and reading and a lot of humanities, communications as well, have studied Vygotsky and his friends in his school in order to learn how to do things today. I, for one, am going to be paying really close attention to the HALU conference. I'm going to try to go to all of the sessions, because going forward, this is not an individual project. Reinventing the university so that we can somehow or other figure out how to educate ourselves in order to survive the climate crisis is not something that one person is going to have a brainy idea and being able to share it and send it off. So I'm going to go to as many of the sessions of the HALU conference as I can, and I'm going to try to take notes, because I think that collectively, that's where the next step is likely to be taking place.
Yeah, and Helena, that is so great. I'm going to be there as much as I can. Linda Liu and I will actually be on a panel with you two, again, a shorter venue. We'll really have to boil it down on Thursday. I just want to say a little bit in response to Jason's point, maybe Ben's, is that, why I absolutely think we shouldn't be seeking to just reproduce the university as it is. I think we should be trying to repurpose the spaces the university still offers so that we can turn it into a bastion, I mean, to whatever limited way we can, of stirring up critical and worker and class and ultimately revolutionary consciousness throughout the society. Okay. I mean, to the extent that contingent faculty share a lot of experience, acknowledged or not, with many of our contingent, present and future contingent worker students, I think that if we could actually think about if we can come out of the closet as contingents and as organizers, get our unions to give us cover, to teach the university for a week, to push further. I mean, I think we can at least, we can try to go on the offense a little bit. And I like to think of this national labor movement for higher ed is defensive, but it's defensive so we can go on offense, right? I mean, not to say that we should constrain ourselves to the classroom. Obviously, we, non-tenure track faculty and a tenure track person and some non-academics have formed this teaching space we're on right now. I think it's a yes. I see it as a yes and thing, but I think that we really need to find ways to use union leverage and to allow us to try to politicize the classroom more. I mean, and at some point I'd love to do a show or a HELU session on just like, how do people relate to labor, or how do people relate to politics in the classroom, and how does your union relate to that? And both labor issues, but also, again, the climate, the class struggle, the war, the empire. I don't know. I feel like we should use what we've got until they fucking take it away from us, and then we'll build. But you're right. We shouldn't be naive about the current system. But I don't know. I mean, again, I'm wage dependent too. So, it's where I'm making my living. And I think it still gives me a little space to make qualitative change beyond just, reproducing the same old, same old. I don't know how other people relate to this.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here and just be mindful of the time that we have left. So we have one more question from Lori Stoff that we're going to take. And then we're going to go to brief closing statements after responding to a question from our panelist and respondent. Okay, Lori.
Hi, thanks so much. I really appreciate everything that's been said. I have a question coming from a somewhat different position in Arizona, a right to work state with no collective bargaining rights, where we have just started a United Campus Workers chapter in the last year and have really struggled as a minority union who will never have the power to do the kinds of things that y'all are doing in places like New York and Massachusetts and California. What advice then do you have for our unions working at the premier neoliberal institution in the country, Arizona State University, and in a state where our legislature is currently considering legislation that would make it illegal to talk about race in the classroom. And a lot of people are already scared, because of their contingent status to even talk about controversial topics because they would get fired. What advice would you have for us to try to mobilize and organize in large numbers and build collective power?
I would suggest documenting everything. Treat it like a collective grievance. Get people to write their experience, track what happens. I mean, as you put it, you're in an important place. Your opposition is very powerful and extreme, and you're a hot ticket. I think you could plan a 1 year or a 2 year, no 1 year, a 1 year project, which you would wind up being a book, which would be the story of your organizing, and get as many people as possible to contribute to it. And have it make it a public record of how hard it is to do what you're doing. I mean, this is, you're teachers, you're writers, you're teachers, you know how to do this. So take advantage of the public realm and blast it out there. That's my suggestion. And, if you want help talking about publishers or, particular how to write a book, you probably know that already, but Joe and I would love to talk to you about it.
I would also say that, it's not fundamentally a different world. What's different is people's imagination of what's possible. You know, I mean, look at what the public school teachers did in Arizona. And I know they didn't win everything they tried to win, but people see that as a victory. I hope people still see it as a primarily positive, victorious struggle. And, you know, that was Arizona, that was Oklahoma, that was West Virginia, you know, that was Kentucky, that was, you know, a bunch of other places. And, you know, two people deciding to act together are the beginnings of a union. That's the core thing, is the feeling of solidarity and the willingness to have people's back. All the other stuff, the laws, the legal recognition, the you know, a treasury, formal officers, a physical location, a contract, you know, all that stuff is ornaments on the Christmas tree. The core of any union is that relationship of solidarity between people. And the more people you have, and the deeper that relation of solidarity, and the closer people can come to a credible threat of disruption, the more you can win from the enemy. And there's no limit. There's no limit. The laws are just a codification of the last truce in the class struggle. And the contract the same. You know, there's no limit to what you can win if you organize enough and are strong enough. I've seen too many places where, you know, where people cut themselves off, bargained with themselves. Look, we had 8 years of Obama bargaining against himself in the presidency, until the last, you know, year and a half, when he started issuing executive orders, which Trump then, you know, dumped all of them. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you know, we can win whatever we can win. You know, we can hold whatever we can hold, and the other stuff is you know, the unions make the struggle, makes the law. The law doesn't make the struggle. There was a time when Oklahoma was the center of socialism in the United States, believe it or not. You know, I mean, I'll stop there. I'm starting to rant, but you know, what you're doing is really important. Everything Helena said is right, I think, but you need to also focus on, you know, what's possible. The rhetoric of you're not New York, you're not Illinois, you're not Massachusetts or California. That's the boss's rhetoric. People are not fundamentally different. Red states and blue states, all that is just, that's obfuscation for our brains. That's their line. Our line is the working class is the majority everywhere.
Yeah, and and obviously the red state revolts, the teacher rebellions from a few years ago were a very stark reminder of that. And I just, again, a highlighted point from the book. I think you kind of touched on it, but you quoted, I think you quoted from John Hess, your longtime organizer and comrade, right? But never let you be alone, right? There always has to be two of you to get anything done. And I just think, you know, like here we are on Tuesday, right? It's like, it's February 2nd, 22nd, 2022. It's Tuesday. It's like, it's all twos. And I just feel like we need to move from like help. If all the ones out there, the isolated ones could even find 1, 2, you know, like a union of two that can just allow people to not feel so alienated and start to like make this, you know, get this alienation outside of themselves, be a huge victory, you know? So, I mean, don't give up hope wherever, even small number of people, right, keeping alive that spark, I think can be, you know, can be the start of something. And just, you know, don't let them put it out, you know, even if you just have a couple colleagues, even at different campuses, you know, that you can keep this alive. You know, we got to, because the system wants to disconnect us, you know, and make us feel like we're powerless. So, but even just a couple people can really reverse that quickly.
I've got to say, the quote is, it's important to get this right. The quote is from Mario Savio, who was a lecturer activist in the California Faculty Association, the California State University system, and is, you know, a real heroic figure in our movement, as well as in the free speech movement and other things that he did. And finally, what I gotta say it, you know, the first book I wrote was directed for people like you who wanted to organize without having anything to begin with. So you might take a look at reclaiming the ivory tower. We didn't specifically mainly focus on that in this book because we wrote that before.
Right, never be the only, right? That's
Yeah.
But I think Laurie is already
And that came out of the Civil
not
War.
alone.
Huh?
Laurie is not alone. She's got a group.
That's right. And then there's tremendous people in that union. And you've got some good advisors in Gary Rhodes and people like that who've been studying this stuff for years and who are not arrogant tenured professors who are really trying to do the right thing.
So, Laurie, do you have a PhD already?
Yes, I was actually a tenured associate professor in my previous life. And then I took this job at Arizona State where I actually gave up my tenure and became a contingent faculty member because they offered me more money and because my family was here. And so I've seen the world from both sides. And now I'm trying hard to organize. And our union here, UCW AZ, is a wall-to-wall union. So it's everybody, all university workers. So we have a contingent faculty working group and I'm heavily involved in that. And we're struggling right now. We're very small, but we'll keep plugging away. But our biggest challenge has been to get tenured folks to support us, which to
Don't
me
worry about that. Organize your colleagues, organize the contingent. Don't worry about it. And if there's anything we can do to help, we want to help because you're doing God's work and she's smiling on you.
Okay, great. So I just want to let everyone know that it is after 9. I'm sure we could keep going for another hour or 2 hours, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So at this point, I'm going to ask our panelists and our respondent to give brief 2-minute closing statements or just say anything that you would like to say as a closing. All right, Joe Barry?
No, Helena, go first.
Helena?
This is a wonderful group. Without listing the dangers that Joe and I have in our book, I want to point out that this group exhibits some of those dangers in terms of age and color. And one of the things that our movement has to do right away all the time is expand beyond a bunch of people who agree with each other and who look like each other. So I want to thank our hosts a whole lot. I know I've said a lot of upbeat things in this, which I intended to do, but I want to end on this cranky note of fear that when we reinvent the university, it's got to look different. That's it.
All right, great. Joe Barry or Joe Ramsey?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I think, this
Okay.
discussion reflects both the strengths and weaknesses of the existing movement. Number one, we managed to talk 2 hours without anybody saying the word racism, which has historically been, the main Achilles heel of the whole American labor movement, and I would argue the whole American left and the whole movement toward radical change in the United States. And, we should know better than that, and so I want to, just expand upon what Helena mentioned.
Yeah.
I think that's, we have to focus. Contingent faculty, people of color and women are much more likely to be contingents than to be full-time tenure track faculty members everywhere, even at HBCU campuses. we need to at the same time we're fighting for what we need vis-a-vis the employer and fighting for what we need within the unions and other organizations. Part of that transformation has to be transforming our own ranks and our own leadership. There's been a lot of wonderful women come forward in this generation of contingent faculty organizing, but there's still a lot to be done. And the default is still white guys, too much. And part of our idea, part of passing the baton is to, change the color and shape of the baton.
So if I following those two comments in a way that actually brings it back to the book, maybe in a I don't want to say a positive note, but trying a bit of synthesis, speaking, from Shelter and Solidarity, which is actually a majority BIPOC and non-male project. I just want to say one of the points I took from Helena and Joe's book, which is really, I think, powerful, is that the fight for contingent faculty rights, and I'm actually going to say here, irrespective of the demographics of the contingent faculty themselves, so that of course what Joe just said is absolutely true about the feminization and the racialization of contingent faculty. But insofar as contingent faculty everywhere, even where they may be majority white, teach disproportionately BIPOC, people of color, working class, non-traditional, first generation students. So I actually want to say that I think there is a synthesis here, which is not to say at all that we don't need to be deliberately conscious of cultivating and encouraging and supporting and recognizing and linking up to existing nodes of non-white leadership in academia and beyond it. But I actually would also I don't want to give up the argument. I don't think we should feel ashamed of, and I'm not saying you're saying we should feel ashamed, but that I think we need to recognize that even a lot of contingent faculty are teaching the Black students on campus in those intro courses, right? Where, and I feel that there is a kind of objective anti-racism of our contingent faculty struggle. This is probably not a note to close this show on, because it may be debatable, but I think that we need to simultaneously work on the subjective anti-racism, as it's been pointed out, but also recognize the objective anti-racism of the struggle for contingent faculty, especially at community colleges, state schools, and institutions, which are often disproportionately BIPOC, first generation, and working class students. So I totally unite with Helena and Joe's call for this, the need to pass the baton and diversify leadership. But I also think we need to recognize the way in which there may be an anti-racist element of the struggle we're already fighting. If we could become more conscious of that, then maybe that's actually how we get the students involved, and that's how we can get them to see this is structural racism. It's not just a contingent faculty issue. This is structural racism. They're not giving you an instructor who can stay around for office hours. They're not giving you someone who you can build, so you can have a fucking letter of recommendation, and someone to start a club with, on campus, right? To actually address the other issues. So I think I'm hopeful that the actual, if we're reflective, the contingent faculty movement can be a leading struggle, a force in the struggle against racism, not only in our own ranks, although that too, but also structurally within the society. And I think we have some leverage to do that in a way that would involve BIPOC faculty and contingent faculty, regardless of their racial position. So I think, to me, that if we can bring those numbers into a conscious anti-racist fight, which I think many of us are predisposed to on some level, and I don't just mean us, but I mean even our liberal colleagues. I don't know. This could be that could be a way in which this becomes a different kind of struggle, and I would love to see that. And I hope we can all march together, on that. I'm sorry, I'm talking like the host closing. I'll shut up. But anyway, I'm just grateful to be part of this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe Barry. Thank you, Helena, and thank you, Joe Ramsey, for a stimulating conversation. And thank you to our audience for participating and for being here today. And right now I am going to pass on the closing of our show to Seren Midliar.
I feel after 2 hours that we, as Linda pointed out, could go on a lot longer. I also, after 2 hours, lacked the power of synthesis, and yet this conversation calls for synthesis. I do note, though, as Joe and others have pointed out, there will be a few more days of structured conversations via Helu. I should also add that Shelter in Solidarity, based on who we are as individuals, means that we will be continuing this conversation in many places. So for now, I want to certainly thank Joe and Helena for not only writing a good book, but also doing the decades of work necessary to produce such a book. I remember when I was a graduate student, someone pointing out that, you know, if you're going to write about the peasantry, right, you can only write about 1 or 2 books in your whole lifetime, because it spends that amount of time to be able to get to know them. And I feel that is also true of organizing and activism. We're constantly learning. And I think to the extent that this reflects many different lifetimes of learning, we are lucky that Joe and Helena chose to produce this book and present it to us. With that said, I'd like to turn to some of the themes that I've heard without attempting real synthesis. The challenges of remaking the university and addressing the questions, not the questions, the fact of racism. I think that might in fact have been part of the impetus behind Ben and Jason's comments about remaking the university or abolishing the university, given its where it falls within society. However, Joe Ramsey has presented us with an interesting question about how, as people of color, as women have entered the ranks of the academy, full-time tenure track positions begin to evaporate, and the majority faculty are denied the tools that they've denied use of the tools that they already possess. They are denied use by virtue of their employment conditions. And so we can connect that with the question of racism, as Joe Ramsey has pointed out. So we will be having future conversations. I'll just point out several conversations that we plan to host going forward. One, we'll be doing a show on International Women's Day, and some of these themes are likely to be raised there. We'll also be looking a little later in March, right after the inauguration of Gabriel Boric in Chile, at the elections in Chile and the connections to the social movements there. What's so noteworthy about the social movements there is that one can really date the big transformation of that country and its leftward tilt to the emergence under neoliberalism of a student movement at the end of the at the beginning of the 2010s. And so we'll be exploring these issues in that space as well. Finally, we are going to do a show in April on Earth Day, and that will involve the speculative fiction writer Vandana Singh. And again, we will be addressing many of the themes that emerge here, including what role higher education can play in addressing the major existential questions facing us. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. One other point I'd like to make really quickly is that our show ends officially as soon as we stop going on Facebook. Those who want to stay around for a few minutes to chat with each other, you may do so. And with that said, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Hardball Press, a publisher of working class stories, Community Church of Boston, Encuentro Cinco, the journal Socialism and Democracy, and the Liberty Tree Foundation.